Atif Nawaz, as he's introduced himself, is a BBC cricket commentator, comedian and activist. Welcome, Atif. Sarah Firth is a foreign correspondent with more than 15 years' experience of reporting from all over the world with some of the world's best-known international news organizations. She's covered many conflicts from the front line, including in Syria, Libya, Azerbaijan, and most recently, Ukraine. We're also expecting Ridwana Walis Lahir. We're told she's running late. She's the CEO of Penny Appeal, and she has recently returned from Cairo, where she's been overseeing a huge humanitarian relief effort for the people of Gaza. So hopefully it won't be too long before she's with us. I think we'll stick broadly to UK domestic media and online platforms for now, because if we widen it up to international media, we don't really have enough time to cover all of that, although there are some very important points to be made about it, but that will maybe for another time. There have been, as I have just mentioned, accusations of biased reporting by the mainstream media. For example, language has been a big issue. Some victims have been described as being killed, where others are simply dead. Adjectives like the brutal killing have been applied to some victims and not others. There's been criticism that there's a lack of context when telling the story, that not enough emphasis has been given to aid workers about what's happening on the ground, and that Palestinians are continuously asked to condemn the actions of Hamas as if it's some kind of litmus test. So, Atif, would you agree with some of these accusations?
I would. I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. It's very difficult. I mean, I can speak to my experience at the BBC. There's been a lot of reports as well about staff at the BBC being really aggrieved with the way the whole conflict has been reported, the language, as you've mentioned. There's been publicised reports about BBC staff members crying in bathrooms and things like that. This is all reported in the mainstream media. And, I know for a fact there's many people that took a stand and, decided to walk out. There's others who wanted to stay inside and work within the framework to try and change the narrative. I know of people who've requested meetings with editorial editors to find out why such wording is used, and others who wanted to take a stronger approach and write a formal letter. So I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a formal letter. It's been publicized on social media, which has been signed by multiple BBC journalists, Muslim. I believe they're all Muslim. It's anonymous, although I don't mind telling you that I was one of the signatories, who were disappointed with the language, wanted it cleared. They used the exact example that you brought up of died versus killed. And it was published, the letter was eventually published by Al Jazeera on their platform. Oh, it was possibly AJ+, but I think it was Al Jazeera. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, and I think the logic of Muslim broadcasters, Muslim journalists within these institutions is, look, the world is turning away from mainstream media. You are already facing the challenge of social media, like, with young people. We had a panel discussion yesterday of 5 very high-achieving individuals under the age of 30, and they all essentially talked about not referring to mainstream news anymore. This is our brightest and best, and this is what they've deemed as the best way for them to get their information. So if you want traditional media, or mainstream media as we call it, to stay relevant, you've got to be significantly more objective. So that's a little response, I would say, just based on my experience. Just
to elaborate on the example that you gave of, you're right, it's 8 BBC journalists who wrote a letter to Al Jazeera, and they weren't named. But in addition to that, at the start of the conflict, soon after October the 7th, more than 100 journalists from organizations such as Reuters, The Guardian, and The Washington Post wrote an open letter specifically in grievance about some of the points that I've made: language, lack of context, lack of Palestinian voices, the dehumanization of Palestinians, etc., etc. So there's been more than one letter. So this really serves as evidence, I suppose, that within the industry people are deeply concerned about the way that some strands of the mainstream media has been reporting this conflict. Sarah, I want to ask you, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I know that you've been, obviously you're aware of how the civilians affected by the war in Ukraine were reported in the Western media, in mainstream British media. And I know that you've been following the recent events in Gaza very closely as well. In the letter that the BBC journalists, what they wrote was, and this is to quote, "A double standard in how civilians are treated is seen, given that it is unflinching in its report of alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine. It hasn't been the same in the reporting of the victims of the Gaza attack." Is that something that you would agree with?
I think it's a really important question. I try to avoid as much as possible conflict comparison, usually, because, you know, as you know, conflicts are so nuanced, and so doing comparisons very rarely is beneficial. What I would say in this instance, though, and I think it was Amnesty International that have said this a few times, that what's striking is that what you had in Ukraine in the initial stages, where there is a lot of confusion, there's a fog of war, and you're still trying to figure out what was happening, but you had a very clear aggressor in Russia, and Russia is not an ally of the West. So when we're talking about British media, it was very easy to condemn, and you wouldn't even have thought twice, I didn't, about my social media, for example, what I was saying, what I was putting out there. And so what I think Amnesty are the ones who said it originally in the past, is that as the British media and as journalists, for politicians and government leaders and policymakers, if you're only willing to call out war crimes, if you're only willing to call out wrongdoing when it's your enemy, not your ally, then you don't stand for human rights. In fact, it's the most important when it is an ally, when you can have influence. That's the moment that you need to stand up and speak to what is happening. It's very easy when the aggressor is Russia to say it very clearly in unequivocal language, condemn their actions for the horrificness of what they've been doing on the ground in Ukraine. And no one bats an eyelid. And it's been extremely disturbing to see what's been going on in newsrooms, to read about journalists' experiences. I know it myself. It's such a sensitive issue to be very aware of what you're saying. And we have the evidence coming out of the impact on people's careers in this industry, in terms of feeling that they are being silenced. I think when something like this takes place, I've been, watching very, very closely, because it is easy to criticize the mainstream media. But these are institutions that have done world-class reporting and have world-class reporting, the best of the best. And, for all of the sort of social media, digital age that we're seeing emerge now, which has so many benefits, we don't want to lose that wisdom, that knowledge, that experience that is such a fundamental basis of being able to get on the ground when the situation is in crisis and get it right. One thing I would say in terms of the language and what we've been speaking about in this sort of, the biggest thing for me, watching what's happened in the reporting, is that the British media have framed what has happened since the October 7th attacks as a conflict originating and starting there. And the lack of context that people have felt able to give and the lack of background has influenced everything from there. And we all know as journalists, it didn't start on October 7th. Now even saying that, I get concerned about someone hearing that and misconstruing it and taking it the wrong way. But what it means is, I think in this example, context is absolutely critical in journalism for understanding what's going on. But in this instance, the context was used and seen and viewed, and I've seen many people attack people who tried to put in that context very early on as a justification for what happened on October 7th. And like you said, seeing endless Palestinians who've been asked to unequivocally condemn Hamas's attacks in Israel. I mean, how many Palestinians do you need to, how many people do you need to explain that, of course, they have nothing to do with that, and of course, they condemn the attacks. But the lack of ability to, and our hesitance in the British media in particular, to apply that context in this situation and to frame what has been happening as originating on October 7th has wildly misrepresented and really, I think, blocked our understanding. And what then we had the gap filled with was social media for the first time, in a way that even in Syria, when you had the situation in Aleppo going on and journalists couldn't get to the ground, social media played such a critical role then. This is the first time I think what we've seen is, this is the narrative that's being presented, or these are the facts that are being presented, and in traditional newsrooms, there are gatekeepers and there are people at the top, and if your newsroom isn't diverse, there's going to be a certain way that that story is presented. And then you've had that coverage in the British media, particularly at the beginning of this, when it all started, contrasted with not, I hear the term citizen journalists a lot. There have been lots of citizen journalists, but no, dedicated, trained, professional reporters and correspondents who are Palestinian, who are in Gaza, documenting what is happening for us. And the contrast between what we've seen reported by mainstream media and what's been happening on the ground is so stark. And yes, the gaps are closing. And I think as journalists, no one's looking in this profession. You kind of have to have good faith, right? It's a hard job. Getting on the ground in those instances, it's the most difficult job in the world. So I have full respect for journalists, whether you're a social media journalist, a citizen journalist, or you're for a big mainstream organization, you're trying to do your best. But there is no doubt when you're looking at what's happened here, do we have a problem? Yes, a huge problem, because there shouldn't have been that gap in the narrative that's being presented in the British media, and what people have made up their own minds. People are seeing what's happening on social media. So then I think the question right now is, how do we address this so that we get the story right? Because that is our responsibility. If we've acknowledged that there is a huge problem here. You've got journalists that are scared to say anything in support. You've got journalists scared to call out war crimes. You've got journalists scared to report on the things that they're seeing in front of their own eyes. That's our job, to report the facts as we see them and to give the context. You've got journalists afraid to give the context. So there is this problem, and now we really need to work to fix it as fast as possible, because trust is all we have as journalists. And if that goes, you've got nothing. If you don't have the credibility of your audience, that when you're looking at them and when you're on the ground and when you're reporting, when you're writing your article and it's your byline, if you haven't been able to be honest, if you've been silenced in any way, or if you're misleading or succumbing to pressure or self-censorship or open censorship, and you lose that credibility and trust, that's it, it's gone. So we need to really, I think it's a critical moment for the mainstream media in particular to be addressing this problem right now.
Critical moment indeed. Many pertinent points that you have raised there, and I hope we have time to talk in a bit more detail about all of them. But I do want to go back to, you mentioned that the many mainstream journalists on the ground have been doing some fantastic work. So you bring up the issue of authenticity, and I think this is a really very, very important point. Whatever your criticisms of the mainstream media may be, and of course many of them are justified, I think the one thing we can't forget, that even if you disagree with the language, even if you disagree with the narrative, we have the assurance that the footage, at least what we're seeing, is authentic. And I think this is where the advantage of mainstream media trumps social media. So you know that what you are seeing is actually the truth. It's been through a vetting system. There have been checks and balances. Atif, I want to ask you, the other positives is that, at the very least, the likes of Ridwana, who isn't here yet, but she, as I mentioned, she works for Penny Appeal, and she's been doing the rounds on Sky News, on BBC, on ITV, and she is being given a platform to tell the world about exactly how the people of Gaza are suffering, what they need, what humanitarian assistance they need, and how international agencies are working to get that to them. So there is a positive. You know, this is something I think we do need to acknowledge, because at least human rights groups, and it has to be said, pro-Palestinian voices are being given a platform. Is that something you would agree with?
Somewhat, for sure. I think, yes, you're right. There is a platform given to people who want to speak on behalf of the pro-Palestinian side of the argument. I would argue they should have anyway. Like, that's just basic journalism requires that you represent both viewpoints, or both prevailing viewpoints in as balanced a way as you can. You often see sort of news organizations in the modern day celebrating that. Well, look, we had so-and-so representing you. Somebody brought up to me the other day that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but they mentioned to me that Talk TV's Piers Morgan Uncensored show has platformed more pro-Palestinian speakers than any of the major networks in Britain, at least. So
and it has, and he's getting tens of millions of views
absolutely
per show.
Sure. So maybe he's looking at it from a commercial perspective, and you know, I'm not saying that he's got the greatest moral compass when it relates to this issue. I wouldn't speculate about his moral compass, but what I mean is, for whatever reason, if this sort of fringe new, if we can call it broadcaster, is platforming that many pro-Palestinian people, it kind of makes you think, well, hang on, I don't see as many of those voices. Now, I must be clear, it's not. I don't feel like it's as, like, at the very top of this post-October 7th, you saw this huge disproportionate amount of disproportionately few pro-Palestinian speakers or pro-Palestinian representatives or people who sympathize with that side of it. I just felt like there were far too few. I feel like as the court of public opinion has shifted, which I definitely give social media a lot of credit for, just because, you know, where mainstream media was lacking for that, and I'm not one of those people who says just put the whole thing in the bin, but I think there was a definite lack of credibility for me. I feel like a lot of people would agree. When social media filled that gap, public opinion shifted, and then you saw mainstream media catch up a little bit. I mean, just this morning, looking at the BBC homepage, there's a story about somebody who lost the majority of their family to a bombing. There's stories about health groups and their warnings about the prevailing sickness and epidemics that could be rushing through Gaza. There's a little bit more balance now. There's a lot more balance now, is the truth. But for a sort of 2-week, 3-week period, I read someone's message that, and it was a negative message sent to me as a representative of the organization, that he said something along the lines of, you are complicit with the government of Israel for what's happening there because of the way you've represented it. You have legitimized this. You and your, I'm paraphrasing, but you and mainstream media have legitimized this.
If I can just
Sure.
interject at that moment. Sure. Pro-Israeli groups are accusing the BBC of exactly the same thing. And we do need to bear that in mind. So you've got people out there who feel that there is a distortion of the Palestinian view by the BBC. It's getting it from both sides. And Israeli lobby groups are accusing the BBC of exactly the same thing. So, the truth is somewhere in the middle, presumably.
I mean, possibly. My perspective on it is that it's not quite in the middle. We had speakers a little bit earlier in one of the previous panel discussions who were discussing victim advocacy groups for Islamophobia. And they brought up Tell Mama and the amazing work they do. We had them on a panel discussion yesterday as well, which is also available on whatever platform you're watching this on. It was a great discussion. They do amazing work. They have 12 people who work for them, and they've had a total of $6 million in funding. The largest Jewish victim advocacy group, or anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism group in this country, has 600 people working for them, and has received funding in the hundreds of millions. So, I'm not saying one is worse or better, but I feel like one lobby is definitely more structured than the other, and hence the complaints have to be held to a slightly different standard. I feel like that. I'm probably not qualified to speak on it, but in my opinion, I've been told this by the BBC as well. It's like, look, I've been shown the stacks of complaints. They print them out every time they get them. Look, this is how many complaints we're getting from Israeli support groups, lobby groups, even sort of just Jewish people. And then it was pointed out to them, of course, that within the complaints pile for Islamophobia, you'll find a lot of Jewish names in there as well. So it's
but
not.
just bring it back to the point that I was making
Sure.
about how there are positives in the mainstream media. So if I can just kind of bring you back to that, if you could just, elaborate a little bit more on. I know we've already discussed it, but where you believe are the positives and where the negatives are. Although you did mention the negatives in your first answer. So.
To go to Sarah's point, I mean, there have been, particularly in institutions like the BBC, like Channel 4, like whoever the sort of mainstream purveyors of news are, they have access to world-class training facilities, incredible journalists who have phenomenal experiences, who are on the ground. They have that credibility of being on the ground. Where they choose to editorialize is where sometimes my issue kicks in. But there's absolutely no disputing the facility they have, the images that they can show you with complete credibility, and just their ability to tell you stories from around the world. Like, there's no replacement for that.
Would you agree with that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we said, these mainstream organisations come in for a lot of criticism, but I think, we've all worked in the big newsrooms, so we know the unbelievable amount of work. The people that you see on screen and being a correspondent, that was like one stage and a whole team of people verifying and fact-checking and, checking that the images that were going out were just the verification process that goes into producing the work that foreign correspondents in particular do. In situations like this, where there is a lot of misinformation coming out, it's very difficult because you only ever have access to one side of a conflict. Those resources are incomparable, and they're so important, that what you're watching is real, it's verified, it's got a team of experts and very dedicated journalists. You can just, I think as we lose trust, as we see trust diminish in the mainstream media, I think what you can trust is that pretty much any journalist will tell you in those newsrooms around the world, there are extremely dedicated people who are committing their lives to telling you the truth and making sure they get it right. And it's not easy to do, and we make mistakes. At the very heart, and this goes back so much further, though, when it comes to mainstream media institutions, and when it comes to the reporting of what is happening right now in Gaza and what Israel is doing and the conflict. So way, way before. And it's interesting that you mentioned Tamama. I've done stories with them before. They're just an incredible organization, but doing stories like that were always for what would be seen as alternative media organizations. So working for TRT World, we do stories about the rise in Islamophobia. It was an area that TRT were very invested in telling, and it wasn't a story that was really getting a lot of traction or getting told. And why is that? Because it's not a secret. I don't think I'm saying anything new. Most people will tell you that there is not, your coverage is going to be reflective of the editorial decisions being made by management. So what does the head of your newsroom look like? And if there isn't representation at the head of your newsroom, you're not getting stories that are women-focused. You're not getting stories that are focused on the Muslim communities. You're not getting stories from diverse communities across the UK. And that is a major issue when it comes to the British media and the mainstream organisations. And it ranges from even the most well-established organisations in the world that have a lot of credibility. And we've seen that with the BBC. Some of those criticisms that have come from journalists themselves, they're legitimate. The language that's being used, I mean, it would be very interesting further down the line to find out of the head of the management at the BBC, if you went and spoke to them before October 7th about the occupation and what people in Gaza have been going through, how many of them would be able to give you any kind of informed answer about what has really been happening for many, many years. And I don't think it would be the right level of representation. I don't think you'd get, frankly, many intelligent answers.
Just on the point of language, I just want to give a recent example. At the start of the prisoner and hostage exchange process, The Guardian referred to Israeli hostages under 18 as children and Palestinian detainees as people under 18. It came into a lot of criticism for doing so. But I think this is an example of how damaging language can be, and how perceptions of whoever the story is about can be determined by the language that is used by The Guardian. Having said that, The Guardian has also done some very, very good reports out there, but I really just wanted to highlight one example of how, you know, language can be used in a very irresponsible way.
It can be, you're right, and I think, you know what, the journalists on the ground and the people that you see with experience of the conflict, who know what they're talking about, you know, so they have a legitimacy, and they're bringing a level of knowledge that is, you're right, there's some world-class journalism doing exactly what it's designed to do at a moment when we need the truth. There are people on the ground getting the facts, questioning everything, talking to the civilians affected on both sides of this, talking through the trauma, talking through the pain, centering people's stories. That, you know, there has been world-class journalism. When you're talking about language, though, and I think this is, again, where you get we need to take a very hard look at the diversity within our newsrooms, because you have presenters going on, for example, and we've, you know, Shamim, you and me know this from reporting the ground, you'll know this from reporting the newsrooms. Not every topic that you're put on, you're an expert in. That's part of journalism. You have to rely on your journalistic training to go through the basics of making sure that you balance the story, making sure you're getting your facts right, making sure that you're critical. But what's happened in this instance is because there isn't that diversity and that level of understanding of the wider issue. This isn't about the attack on October 7th. It's not about condemning Hamas for their actions only. That is that story, and that was extremely well reported, and the repercussions of that are still being reported. But this is a wider issue of the occupation. And so if you don't have people that understand that, and you end up with language, like one of the things that I've seen that's disturbing, frankly, is the constant use of the repetition of the IDF's use of the justification of Israel having a right to self-defense. And I've seen a number of Palestinians pointing out very fairly, why is it we hear that so much and we don't hear about the Palestinians' right to self-defense? Why are we constantly hearing that from one side and not from another? And that is something that is just down to the people who we're having on the screens, presenting, editorial decisions being made. It's a legitimate question.
Making the distinction here, not so much reporting on the ground, reporting the facts on the ground, which, as we agree, much of it has been very, very good. But when you've got talking heads in a studio, often, you know, this is what is hanging over us, this whole idea that the Western position is that, you know, it's less about Israel being the occupier and the Palestinians being occupied, but more about Israel has this right to defend itself.
Yeah, and I think, again, this comes back to just the fundamental root problem, that in journalism our job is to challenge the assumptions, the questions that are raised. We're there to go and answer, and we are there to challenge government leaders, not to repeat our government line when it comes to the British media. And that, what I said at the beginning of this talk, you know, again, that comes back to the responsibility of, it's so easy to call out human rights abuses, it's so easy to call out actions, and it's easy to criticize when it is an enemy or not our ally that is carrying out potential war crimes. But when it's our ally, when it's an ally of the country that our government leads, as journalists, we have a separation there, because it is literally our job to call out government's positions on things. It doesn't always do any good. Look at what happened in Iraq, you know, look at what's happened in conflicts around the world. But what's happening right now, I think the government's position is changing because the public's position is changing, just like you've mentioned. But at the heart of it, it is the lack of diversity in our newsrooms. And just, I think we can almost overcomplicate the issue here. There is a problem. We know there's a problem. Why is it in this instance causing so much fear, anxiety? Why are we seeing journalists losing their jobs? Why are we seeing journalists feeling silenced? That is an immense issue that we need to deal with within our industry right now. if you are reporting the facts as you see them, 6,000 children have been killed. Is that a proportionate response? Basic facts being reported, people are nervous about reporting. So what I was going to say is in Ukraine, of course you want to verify every bomb that falls, okay? You want to get on the ground and see the aftermath, and you want to interview people, and you want to find out what's happening. The aggressor was Russia. The bombs were coming from Russia. I didn't have to think when I went up live that there are attacks happening right now, and they are Russian attacks. And yet, in Gaza, even now with the resumption of hostilities, we're seeing more reports, and even when it's not people died, but people being killed. Killed by who? You know, killed by who? And people are looking at that language and understanding, you know, that's not right. There's something missing there. You need to be able to say it. They are Israeli bombs that are dropping on Gaza.
Yes,
but
it's a very good point, yes.
The fact that we're so nervous to say it in the industry right now, because we know there are repercussions for people who are doing that, even when it's completely legitimate reporting of the facts.
Right.
That's scary.
Right, I think this session ends at 2:30, I think it is, isn't it? Right. Well, I've got another one at 4:30, so I don't think we can carry on going for too long. All right. Well, given that we do have a little bit more time, there are a couple of more things that I want to ask the panelists about, and I do want to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions as well. So, a couple of more questions that we can discuss, and then we'll throw it out to the audience. I do want to talk a little bit about sourcing. Now, this is where we see many times this huge schism in social media and in the mainstream media. However, on this particular story, some would say that there's been the sourcing that the mainstream media has been, to a great extent, quite problematic. A lot of the information that is coming out from the Israeli side is coming out from the IDF and the Israeli government. Now, it is proven that they have got it wrong in the past. There are many, many examples of where the statements coming from the Israeli government, if taken at face value, are later shown to be not what they had originally said. We've seen this. The example of the 40 babies beheaded is another example. This was one Israeli journalist who heard it from one IDF soldier on the ground. Within 24 hours, it made front page, it was splashed on the front page on most of the British newspapers, and was a leading story on the networks as well. And I think a major concern is that much of what is coming out from the Israeli side of things, and I absolutely accept that the same can be said about information that is coming out that Hamas is releasing. You know, I think independent verification is key here. Often you are lacking that, and yet this is going unchallenged. And I would say, personally, this is a big failing on the part of the mainstream British media. What are your thoughts on it, Atif?
I would certainly agree. I think some of the mainstream media have worked very hard to verify. So I know for a fact the BBC has the Verify service, BBC Verify, and you know they work very, very hard, and this isn't. I think I've read somewhere one of the reporters for them or the contributors for them saying that this is the hardest they've ever had to work to make sure that they don't say anything. They're aware of these examples, so every time problematic language or inconsistent language is used, it's splashed all over social media. You can find every journalist you want. You can find their Twitter handle, their Instagram page, whatever it is, and bombard them with messages. I've seen targeted campaigns towards journalists, which, it's kind of scary because it could be you. You make one error, and you don't know if it's been made in good faith. Or everybody's human, right? And all of a sudden, you're getting labeled this, you're getting labeled that. I will say though that when there's inconsistencies in language consistently there, or even when the truth is stipulated, like you're saying, sorry, it's very important to stick to the facts and make your case from there. Now, sometimes you can continuously push home a fact to reinforce your argument. So, I mean, if you look at the death tolls that have been reported, and, you're right, the IDF has been challenged on some of the numbers that they've put out there, but equally, every single time the numbers are reported from Palestine, It's almost every time you'll see that label, the Hamas-run health ministry reports. Every single time. It doesn't matter that Amnesty International or Save the Children or all of these global organizations have endorsed those numbers. Doesn't matter at all. They must label that every single time.
Well, the problem is those international agencies are not inside Gaza.
Some of them are on the ground.
Well, UN local workers have been, but many of them have been killed.
Sure, they share data and information. Now, recently, I know that some mainstream journalists have been allowed into Gaza under strict supervision, and it's been controlled what they are allowed to put in and out. I think everybody's familiar with the Al-Shifa hospital tapes.
Yes, sorry, I'm butting in here,
Please.
but you've just raised a really important point that I just want to put some emphasis on, is that a lot of the in fact, all the information coming out of, any journalistic reports coming out of Gaza is vetted by the IDF.
Yeah. So how objective is that? Like, if you look at that, now, okay, it's very important for news media from their perspective to say, and they do, to be fair to them, say that, like, this is all we were allowed to show. Yeah. This is all we were allowed to film. This is based on what they showed us. So they're trying to make that very clear distinction. I feel like this process of journalistic integrity has got stronger as it's gone on. There's still examples, and there's some embarrassing examples sometimes, like in The Independent, where Palestine was conflated with Pakistan. Israel and Pakistan resumed relations. This was an actual headline in The Independent newspaper. Blows my mind that could happen in this day and age. But, I mean, you get the feeling that was somebody, it's not a mean-spirited thing, but right now it's more important than ever before for journalists, mainstream media, presenters, reporters, journalists, to be on their A game, because people are ready to leave them. I mean, I tell you again, yesterday, 5 people in this panel, all under the age of 30, say, I don't watch the news. Why would I watch the news? They lie. And when somebody makes a subjective appeal, they throw away all the good things. And you've talked about loads of them, Sarah. There are immense benefits to the news, to news programming, mainstream news programming, from the caliber of the award-winning and well-trained journalists, many of whom I know very personally, and I think of them as mentors. But once you lose that trust, it's almost impossible to get back. When you're a BBC reporter or a independent reporter or Channel 4 reporter or whatever it may be, and you make that mistake, people don't judge you specifically. They'll judge the whole of the BBC, everybody from the people who work in news to the people who clean the toilets upstairs. Like, you're representing that whole group of people. You have to be at the very top of your game now.
Right. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, sourcing, hugely important. I think it's really important when we're talking, again, shout out to the colleagues who've been doing this on the ground since day one, and for years, the colleagues who've been reporting this and raising the issue repeatedly, despite not being able to get the stories passed into the newsrooms. When why is it always on the agenda when there's a situation that's so horrific that the world has to pay attention? There have been warnings for years that this needed a closer eye. So, journalism, when you're on the ground, it is just part of conflict reporting, unfortunately, that most of the time you are in a very controlled environment where you're embedded with one side, you've got access from one side, and your job and your training is to make sure that you're using that access in the way that we have seen the journalists on the ground doing. You're right, it's so important, very credible. They're making sure they inform their audience that they are being restricted in some ways and that they're embedded with the IDF. What you've seen for the first time, I think, really on this scale, and I think this is actually a positive thing, because you had such a large number of well-trained journalists, professional media professionals in Gaza, reporting every day on what's happening. There's been this idea, I think, certainly since it's been changing, but since I came up through the industry and at the beginning of my career, so 26 years old in Syria, what did I know about what was happening in Syria at 26 years old? I had no idea. I relied almost entirely on fixers and producers who were Syrian, who frankly should have been the ones on air giving you the story. But there's this idea that, well, because maybe that's going to affect impartiality and maybe that's going to bias the report, so that's why we send in a foreign correspondent. I think the days of sending in foreign correspondents who don't really have the context and information is over. What we've seen with the journalists on the ground in Gaza is, wait, you can be Palestinian and a media professional and put in place as much as possible in the same way that every journalist has to deal with. Report as impartially as you can. And so we have had this access, mainly through social media, to these incredible, I mean, and I don't think any journalist at all in the world right now would say anything other than they are absolutely the heroes of our profession. The journalists that have been on the ground in Gaza throughout the course of this, getting the truth out there as their own lives and families have been killed, disrupted, devastated, destroyed, and they're still providing accurate reporting. Yeah, shout out to them that they are the heroes of our profession. And so I think we owe them a great deal. And most importantly, what we owe them in the British media here right now is to make sure that we are doing our best to ensure that those voices are getting heard, that level of dedication to impartiality and truthful reporting is getting out there. And to remember at the base of this isn't, we've spoken about this, Shamim. The point of journalism, it's that age-old saying. It's not to have one person saying it's raining and one person saying it's dry outside. It's as a journalist to go out and look at what's happening and decide and report the facts of which one is the truth. And we should never, ever, ever be afraid of the truth. Look at what they've been doing on the ground, and it's our responsibility to do the same right now, even when it's a scary moment. In fact, especially because it's a scary moment for journalists in our profession to speak out. Now's the time that we have to.
Absolutely, and of the 67 journalists, the one that comes to mind, you'll remember Wael Al Jazeera Arabic, who lost his wife, his son, his daughter, and his grandson all on the same day. Absolutely devastating images. It happened while he was reporting, and within days he was back reporting. So it is, as you say, Sarah, they are the true heroes, really risking their lives, losing their family members in order to get the truth out. I am going to bring it to an end now, because I'd be really interested to hear some of the thoughts of members of the audience. And I want to end it on what will hopefully be a positive note going forward. Now, the one point I want to make is, this is not a Muslim issue. At its core, it is a human rights issue, and it is an issue of international law. It is perfectly understandable that Muslims will feel a particular empathy to other Muslims suffering in the war. But really, I think we need to remember that at its core, it is an issue of human rights and international law. So that is one point I want to make. What can we as ordinary citizens do? We do have a voice. I would feel concerned if we felt a sense of helplessness in all of this, although it is natural and understandable when there are moments, and we've all felt it, when we have felt completely helpless. But there have been huge protests, demonstrations going on in London and other cities every single weekend. There are processes. We have Ofcom here in the UK, a broadcasters' regulatory body where ordinary members of the public can write in to complain if they feel that there is media representation or if there is bias or inaccuracies. So there, at least in theory, at least there is a channel there. You can write to your MP. You can boycott products. There are avenues that we can change. Is this really the most important time for us to be engaging in collectively engaging in what's happening, Atif?
Absolutely. I think that's already bearing fruit. We're seeing the tide of public opinion. It's not just Muslim people, as you rightly say. Muslims have great empathy for other Muslims around the world. But when I've attended many of these protests and marches, and I've seen way more than just Muslim people. I've seen Jewish advocacy groups. I've seen LGBTQ advocacy groups. I've seen groups from all over the world. There was a chap at one of the marches who was he was handing out beer as a goodwill gesture. I was like, I think you've got this one a little bit wrong, but it's a very sweet sentiment. People share this around the world, and I think as Muslims or people who are supportive and want to see a free Palestine in our lifetimes.
Well, I think people who don't want to see children being killed.
That too. I think if you want that, you've got to educate yourself now, because your viewpoint is being challenged in ways it's never been challenged before. Like the framing of the conversation has been incredibly difficult. and incredibly challenging. You need to have the information and the knowledge. You have to have that critical thinking to read everything you read, to be able to challenge it and make a decision on whether you think this is objective and something that should go into your mind. The responsibility is very much on ourselves to learn and don't just absorb like sheep, but learn and actively engage with what we're reading.
Sarah, does collective action work?
Yes, and I think it's really important for people not to, it is easy to succumb to those feelings of helplessness and overwhelm. What I would say, even with the marches, there are people who've been scared to go on the marches in case an employer finds out and things like that, in this country. And we've seen some of the headlines at the beginning of those marches and the way that they were framed. I've been there reporting on the marches.
Hate marches.
Reporting of the language like that from Suella without the challenge. It's so dangerous. Some of those headlines weren't just Islamophobic. They're dangerous because we've seen the numbers. We've seen the spike in the number of Islamophobia issues and attacks taking place since this. So what I would say, though, at this moment is it can be so emotive, whatever side of this you're on. And in London, we're a really diverse city. And, across the UK, we're a diverse country. And I've really learnt this over the years and years reporting, whatever your personal feelings are about it. Our job as journalists is to keep our emotions out of it. It's very difficult to do. But there are people on both sides of this who are personally impacted and who are absolutely terrified right now and who are living through unimaginable trauma and grief and processing that. So I think it's so important to have in our minds always when we're engaging in discussion and dialogue to just be very aware about who it is you're speaking to and the difference that you're coming, if you've got an opinion on something, you've got to be very careful about the fact that there are people in a very real way being impacted. So in terms of collective action, I think the most powerful thing you can do as a human right now is engage in that humanity and be reaching out to people within your communities who might be impacted and asking them, are they okay? Have they been impacted? How are they doing? And that's the way I think tomorrow there's actually going to be in London a joint peace vigil, I think, that's being held between members of the Jewish community and members of the Muslim community. Look for those people who are at a moment of incredible division, not just in the world, but in our country right now. Look for those people who are trying to bring people together and remove some of that fear and remove some of that divisiveness. And I think that is the most powerful way as humans we can navigate our way through this with humanity.
Yeah, brilliant. Very, very strongly put. Thank you very much, Atif and Sarah, for your extremely pertinent, hugely important points. Many, many important points you've raised in the past hour or so. So I'd like to hand this over to you guys now. If there's anything, if you have a question for Atif or Sarah or myself, or if you just want to make a point, just raise your hand and we'll make sure that the mic comes around to you. If you have a question for a specific person, if you can let us know who that is, that'd be great. And if you could just give us your name as well, please.
Thank you, Shamim. I am Malik Mohammed. I just wanted to thank yourselves for the reasonable, passionate, and intelligent way in which you brought critical thinking to this subject. And thank you for your sacrifices.
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind of you to say so. This gentleman in the camel-coloured coat at the front.
Hi, I'm Heship Penny Appeal. Unfortunately, Ridwan couldn't be here, but
you should have joined us on the stage.
No, it's fine. No. I was actually out in Cairo recently as well, but
right.
I'd like to also thank you for your time and everything that you've said. I'd also like to pretty much agree with everything that you've also said in terms of people are turning to social media for verification rather than the mainstream media. And that's for the reason of them losing belief in the mainstream media for whatever reason. But I think for the example of Mehdi Hassan, MSNBC, his show got taken off, very credible journalist. And I just think I know everyone's trying to do their job, and it's a very difficult situation to try and verify which side is right. But I think all we can do on that side of things is get the information for ourselves and make our own decision. But I believe, from what I agree, that there's more Palestinian voices than there were before, and it's going in the right direction. But I think more needs to be done. The lobbies are still stronger on one side than the other. And until that changes, I think a lot of us will still lose that belief in the mainstream media. But
Thank you for your observations. Anyone else? Gentleman in the dark woolly hat at the back there. Right. Well, to be clear of the facts, the anti-Semitism march that took place, I think it was last Sunday, they made it absolutely unequivocally clear that they did not want Tommy Robinson at the march. They told the police, he turned up anyway, and he was subsequently arrested and charged. So, without any evidence to corroborate the fact that there are elements of the pro-Zionist movements that are endorsing him, it's not something that I would like to confirm. I haven't seen any evidence of that. The only evidence that I've seen is that they have been, that he was arrested, basically. They got rid of him, and they have openly dissociated themselves with him. But you do bring up a very interesting point, and that is how, you know, clearly it's proving to be, the war in Gaza is proving to be very decisive. There's an element, it can't be denied, that there's of tribalism in it. I don't necessarily think this is helpful, but perhaps it is inevitable. And it's proved to be polarizing. And when you when this kind of situation happens, sadly, you do find extreme elements on all sides trying to gain some kind of, trying to give themselves a voice. Sometimes it works, maybe it works temporarily, other times it doesn't. And in the case of Tommy Robinson, I would say he has fallen flat on his face. Whatever his intentions were, it clearly hasn't worked. But the wider issue of polarizing communities, sadly, we are seeing evidence of that. And my belief is that it's not really helpful to the overall cause, and that is to stop civilian deaths. I don't know how my panelists feel about this. I think we need the mic.
it goes back to what Sarah was saying about also the previous Home Secretary, divisive language that, you know, raises different divisions in our society, which can be very dangerous, i.e. Tommy Robinson, what had happened. It had nothing to do with us or with the pro-Palestinian marches or anything else, but it was, you know, all this divisive language that has been used with the former Home Secretary, but it's not helped the situation whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, when that language was first came out, I mean, it really inflamed me personally. I found it detestable because for me it was giving a free ride to people who were on the right wing. It felt like, I mean, again, I'm speculating.
Well, it's hate speech.
Let's
call it what it is.
It's insightful. It's insightful, right? You're essentially giving people moral permission to go and disrupt a march. And if you're the Home Secretary of the country, you certainly shouldn't do that anyway. But if you're the Home Secretary, you certainly shouldn't be involved anywhere near that kind of thing, escalating things like that. You have a greater responsibility. Obviously, she's not there anymore, and I don't know if people somewhere out there, some lawyers are looking into criminal charges and things like that, because I feel like they could probably make a good case. You're absolutely, I mean, the brother who brought him up, like, I mean, I think most people can see through Tommy Robinson and people of his ilk and their opportunism in trying to do what it is they're trying to do. I'd like to believe that, nobody wants someone like that attending their cause, whatever their cause is, unless their cause is as vile as his cause. So, yeah, it's hard to give credence to that. But, sometimes you worry about the people that are agreeing with you. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you make a point and certain people agree with you, you start to think about your point, if you know what I mean. Should I really have that point because that person agrees? Do you know what I mean? One of those type things.
Yeah, I mean, you both basically said it very eloquently, and it was a really good question. And it's part of what, as communities right now, we have to work really hard to be aware of and push back on. And as journalists as well, calling out this type of divisiveness, the rhetoric when it happens, and calling it what it is. There are, unfortunately, always elements on all sides that are the fringe elements that try and use a moment of divisiveness to spread more fear, to spread more trauma, to cause more hate. And it is what we said, why more than ever, people like you working at the Penny Appeal on the ground, the journalists on the ground, the incredible Palestinian journalists, just keeping our focus and our minds on the people that are impacted by this, the people who are fighting for the truth, and trying as best we can to just combat those who are pushing for more division and support those who are finding as much as possible a way to use this unbelievable moment of trauma and fear and division and to find a way forward, a peaceful way forward, because again, at the root of this, it's stopping what is happening right now. The resumption of the attacks on Gaza that we're seeing, the children that are being killed, that is at the forefront of so many people's minds. So that is, that's where all our attention should be.
One more question. Anyone? No? Oh, we have a hand there.
So you spoke about the lack of diversity within upper management of some of the newsrooms and organisations. In your experiences, to what degree is challenge encouraged and accepted of those individuals? That's a great question.
Sarah, you were the one who...
Yeah, I mean, again, speaking to my experience in my outlets, but also knowing a lot of the people in the mainstream outlets, I can't emphasize enough for all the criticism that mainstream media gets, just the level of dedication. You spoke about the BBC's verification team. This is like critical, historical work that we're going to, it's just so vital. So these are institutions and newsrooms where you have so many passionate people doing their job that are just highly trained and at the very top level. When it comes to management in the newsrooms that I've been in, are they predominantly male? Yes. In Britain, are they predominantly white male? Yes. Are they predominantly old white male? Yes. I mean, look at even with foreign corresponding, I'd say, and it's changing. We've grown up, thankfully, in an industry where women have been welcomed into conflict zones and we've had a chance to be on the ground and reporting. But even that, I think there's still too much gatekeeping, frankly. The newsrooms are not diverse enough in Britain. Everyone knows that. It's no secret. You look at the figures of representation, they're appalling. And it means that we're not getting, when the moment matters, we're not getting the diverse range of knowledge and facts from journalists who have lived experience. So it is changing, and it's changing because, like I said, in the past, when I was starting out, I was deployed to Syria as a white British girl. There's lots of justifications for that and reasons for it, to connect with an audience or whatever. But the point is that I think there was this misconception that's been long held in Britain that you need someone, a white British, usually male, correspondent on the ground to give us the impartial facts. Well, actually, no. I think what we've realised is you can be impartial and a highly trained journalist, but it's better if you understand the country that you're reporting on, preferably have the language skills and have the context and background information. And what this is currently showing us right now, this situation, with what the Palestinian journalists have been doing from the ground, is that is top-level reporting. You can be in the middle of it, experiencing it, and still give, to the best of your ability, impartial reporting about what is happening. You don't need a white, male, British correspondent to tell you the facts of the story. And in fact, if you try and do it just that way, you're going to get the wrong story because you're not getting the context, you're not getting the background, you're not getting the understanding. So thankfully, I think times are changing. when it comes to diversity in the newsrooms in Britain, though, we are shockingly far behind where we should be in terms of diversifying our newsrooms. And that's not a secret. And newsrooms are learning the hard way, because right now, some of the incredible work being done by journalists gets undermined when newsrooms and editorial decisions make mistakes and get the story wrong. Yeah.
Just on that point to add, I think there was a time when, Sarah, you said that if you have a white male middle-class man somewhere or other telling a story, then you had the assurance, then it would be accurate and objective. And I think there was also a sense of trust. Yeah. There was this idea that this white middle-class man is more trustworthy as a journalist than somebody else. And I think that has really changed. Actually, there's been a U-turn on that. I think there is a growing sense that, what is this, man from Hampshire doing there, when the story would be told much better by, a woman from Mumbai, because the story's in Mumbai. So there is, this perception is changing, I do think.
The only way we ever do the stories, as you know from your time in the field, often is with the fixers and producers, right?
Yes.
Like we've had this conversation so many times. Behind the person being put on screen is a team of journalists that are working, and so often in the case where you're reporting story, you just want to hand the microphone over.
Yes.
And that's what it is time for us all to do in this industry, actually. It's hand the microphone over to the people who have more knowledge, more information, more context, more experience.
I think that's a really good point to end it on. I hope you found it useful. And I think the takeaway from this is, tempting though it might be, we should really try our hardest not to polarize the greater discussion on Gaza and also media's role in it. My personal view is mainstream media is not all bad. Authenticity is hugely important when reporting this kind of conflict. At the very least, we get authenticity, verification of picture and footage coming in the mainstream media. That's at the very least. It's actually, I think we all agree, it is doing some very, very good work. At the same time, social media has turned the tide of opinion. It plays a crucial role. And of course, the most important people in all of this are the incredible journalists on the ground in Gaza who are risking their lives every single day to tell the truth and to tell us the story. The other point that I think we can conclude with is that all of us as citizens have a voice. We may feel helpless when we see these awful pictures on screen. We may feel that there's nothing that we can do. What we can, we've seen protests. You can, as I'm repeating myself here, but just to emphasize, you can write to your MP, you can write to the BBC, you can write to Channel 4 News, you can boycott products. There's plenty that we as citizens can do. So collective action at a time like this, I would say, is more important than ever. Thank you very much to my panelists, Atif Nawaz and Sarah Firth, and thank you all. Thank you to the audience as well. I hope you enjoyed it.